Hi, everybody. Hi. Thank you for being here. I'm pleased to be joined by Senators Stabenow, Whitehouse, and Schatz, who you'll hear from in a minute. Now, yesterday we received President Trump's budget. A budget lays out the president's priorities. It's clear. This president cares about enriching the wealthiest few and doesn't care one bit about middle-class families and those trying to get there. It is unbelievable. The Trump budget calls for $1.5 trillion cut in Medicaid, $850 billion cut in Medicare. It eliminates programs vital to rural and small cities like CDBG, cuts agriculture, cuts NIH research, and is hypocritical. On the cover of the budget, I wish I had it here. Anyone got one? We don't have a budget? Shucks, make believe I'm holding it up. It says, promises kept. President Trump, I will not cut Medicare or Social Security. President Trump's budget slashes it. President Trump, I am going to make education a civil right. President Trump's budget slashes education. President Trump, we need a major infrastructure program. President Trump's budget cuts transportation by 21%. The amount of hypocrisy here between what President Trump says and what his budget does is amazing. And what his budget does is help the wealthy, helps the powerful, and hurts the middle class and those struggling to get to the middle class. Totally the opposite of what he says. So I'd like to see Mitch McConnell put the budget on the floor. Let's see a vote on that. He wants to put Green New Deal on the floor? Let him I challenge him. Put the president's budget on the floor. Let's have a vote. Let's see how many Republicans vote for it. Let's see how many Republicans want to cut money for rural airports, cut money from the Army Corps in flood control with all the flooding we have by a third, and take money away from our military and put it into an $8.6 billion border wall. So the bottom line is very simple. Promises kept, bunk. One of the biggest lies that we have ever seen in the last several years in this government. And the promises are not kept. The budget should be entitled Promises Broken. Now, on the emergency declaration, there are three clear reasons to vote in favor of this resolution saying there's no emergency. First, there is no factual basis for an emergency. The president himself made it clear when he said, I don't have to do this. That's not an emergency. Second, it would take money away from the military, the brave men and women in uniform, to pay for this wall, including military construction and maybe even military pay and pensions. Outrageous. But most importantly, it dramatically changes the balance of power in our government. It alters how the Constitution intended us to work. The Founding Fathers were geniuses. One of the main things they were worried about was overreaching of the executive branch. And they put checks and balances, particularly the power of the purse. To undo this by allowing the president to declare an emergency would fundamentally change the way our government works and would be a real decline in our democracy, plain and simple. We hope our Republican colleagues will have the courage to stick up for the Constitution, stick up to what the Founding Fathers wanted, and tell Donald Trump on this one, we don't go with you. Even people who are for the wall should be voting against an emergency. Senator Stabenow.
Thank you, Senator Schumer. I'm really pleased to be here with my colleagues to speak about the president's budget because it's pretty ugly. To reemphasize what Senator Schumer said, it fails to invest in people or communities or our future, and it starts with cuts in Medicaid of $1.5 trillion. And let me just stress that 2 out of 3 senior citizens in nursing homes get their care paid for through Medicaid in this country. $800 billion in Medicare cuts. And this is, as we know, after the president has said over and over again he wouldn't cut Medicare, and yet that's in his budget. we know that people depend on Medicare and Medicaid, both for their own health care as well as their children, and they are very concerned about what's happening to their moms and dads in nursing homes. This also repeals the ACA, no replacement, cuts health research. I mean, this really is an attack on health care in our country, plain and simple. And the Trump budget does turn its back on communities, urban and rural. Just months ago, we signed a historic bipartisan farm bill. Very pleased to help lead that. In this budget, the president cuts 31% of the farm bill programs that we just passed, and another 15% from the department to be able to help administer it. He kills community development block grants, which are so critically important to communities large and small to create jobs and improve communities. And I have to say, on behalf of Michigan, he once again guts funding to protect the Great Lakes. 90% of our fresh water of our country surrounds my beautiful state and 8 states, and this president turns his back on the Great Lakes states and protecting our water. So, no matter what your opinion going forward on any individual effort, it is absolutely true that this budget turns its back on the people of our country. Let me just say one other thing in terms of rejecting the president's emergency declaration to fund his campaign promise. No matter your opinion on border walls, it's the job of Congress, not the president, to determine federal spending priorities. We need a budget that invests in our people, our communities, our future. We need a president who respects the role of Congress and lets us do our job. We invite Republican colleagues to join us in stopping the president's effort to undermine Article 1 in the Constitution.
Senator White House.
I don't know how many times you all have heard Democrats warn that what the Republican Party wants to do is to cut Medicare and Medicaid, to pay for tax cuts for rich people and big corporations. That's been a common theme for many years. Well, if you look at this budget, it's time to say, we told you so. Last April, CBO priced out the cost of the Republican tax cut bill, which primarily went to the benefit of very rich people and very big corporations, and it priced it out at $2.314 trillion. This budget cuts Medicare and Medicaid by $2.345 trillion. It's like a 99% perfect match between the tax cuts for rich people and big corporations and the proposed cuts to the people who are served by Medicaid and Medicare. So we told you they were going to do it. They're doing it. And I don't think Americans are going to think that's a very good idea in the 2020 election. Let me conclude by saying that the vote on the national emergency gives Republicans a very, very clear choice. Do you put the Constitution first, or do you put President Trump first? Because the choice could not be clearer that it is Congress that has the power of the purse and the power to appropriate. Speaking of which, one of our appropriators, Brian Schatz.
The president is putting the Department of Defense in an impossible situation. Throughout this administration, the Department of Defense has tried to avoid being polarized and politicized, but we've seen over and over again that everything that the president touches becomes tainted in some way. For the DoD, that process began in earnest last year when thousands of our men and women were deployed not to a war zone, not to a trouble spot, but to our own southern border. The emergency declaration is the next step down that road of our military being politicized. The president is asking the department to go against its own best interests to raid military funds to pay for a campaign promise. But DoD has a role to play under the law. They must determine whether the construction of the wall furthers their mission. Meanwhile, they know that Fort Greely needs a new ground-based missile interceptor field. They know that Fort Meade needs a security gate to stop unauthorized vehicles from coming onto the base. They know that Fort Campbell needs a new middle school so that kids can go to a school without asbestos and lead-based paint. And the Department of Defense knows that each of these projects is more important than the president's wall, that the people who will be hurt most if they go through with this are their own service members. In the short term, they will be less prepared to complete the mission. In the long run, they will be less able to maintain the public's trust and bipartisan cooperation with the legislative branch, and that is unacceptable.
Now we're going to redo this now that I have the budget. This budget says promises kept. It's one of the biggest lies we've seen come down the pike out of Washington in a long time. The president said he'd preserve Medicare and Medicaid. He broke that promise. This budget slashes it. The president said he believes in a major infrastructure bill. This budget breaks that promise. He slashes transportation by over 20%. The president said education is the major civil rights of our time. He broke that promise because he slashed education funding as well. There are no promises kept in this budget. It's a long list of promises broken. Now we'll take your questions.
Have you advised Democrats not to dwell on the prospect of impeachment?
Look, I'm going to wait for the Mueller report. We have to see what the Mueller report says, I think, before making any conclusion.
Do you feel that it hurts the party to look like you're focused too much on impeachment?
Wait for the Mueller report. The public will see. The one thing we should be doing right now, in my opinion, is making sure that the entire Mueller report, with appropriate redactions for protecting intelligence, be made public, and then let's see where the public is.
Mr. Leader, do you think impeachment would be too divisive for the country?
I think that when the public sees the report, they will come to a judgment. And it may be a judgment that's divisive, or it may be a judgment that brings everybody together, one way or the other. Let's wait for the report.
Do you think the Democrats would get behind a proposal to update the National Emergencies Act?
The first thing to do is make sure that we declare that there is not an emergency now, for all the reasons I mentioned. To update the National Emergencies Act, for our Republican friends to say, we'll let Trump declare any emergency he wants, but a future president can't, that doesn't work. So we'll have to look at what they did. But first, let's see if our Republican friends have the courage to say that this is not an emergency.
To that end, on impeachment, are you out of sync, though, with the Speaker of the House? She's not waited for the Mueller report. She's obviously made her point known.
I think that we both believe that the Mueller report, we should wait for the Mueller report. She just commented on what her standard would be once the Mueller report comes out.
Senator Schumer, are you concerned that with the president's budget serving as kind of an opening bid, that a caps deal is less likely and perhaps a default
I think the
issue?
only way we'll get a budget is the way we got one the last 2 years, if the president stays out of it. I think if you talk to my Republican colleagues and they told you what they're telling us, they'd say the same thing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Promises kept, promises broken.